My name is Devyn Remme. I am sitting now in the Center for Climate and Energy Transformations at University of Bergen. I did my master's on the social issues related to sustainable mobility transitions here in Norway. And now I've just started the PhD on the global impacts of the Nordic EV revolution. So I've just started in November, but I have already got a paper in review for international development policy, and that's what I'll be focusing on today. And it's basically a preliminary mapping based on a desk study on secondary data to get an idea of what the value chains and commodity chains related to EVs are, and what the trade-offs might be. So the project includes social and environmental impacts, which is somewhat uncommon and very challenging given the complexity and shifting nature of these chains. So one of the major insights I've already realized is that it might be ideal to enlist specialists and researchers that have knowledge about specific regions and sectors, and then that my role is more of a meta compiling of these different expertises and sort of weaving these stories that tell us something about the global impacts of the Nordic EV revolution. So in the end, I would love to do a special issue for a journal, or maybe put together a book or website. So I know some of you in the audience might be interested in that in a few years' time. Okay, our starting point here is the EVs in Norway, and we have this picture from the American Super Bowl that tens of millions of people saw, where Will Ferrell is urging Americans to be just as good as Norwegians with their electric vehicles. And the upsides of electrification of the car fleet are often celebrated without a lot of attention to the challenges and downsides. In order for electric vehicles to deliver on their promise of low emissions, the electricity sector itself must be renewable, and that transition relies on non-renewable resources that we mine. And the transition, and those materials that we need for the energy transition are very similar to the materials that we find in EVs. And I'm primarily focusing on lithium-ion batteries, because they're the sort of beating heart of renewable energy transitions and of the EV itself. So the argument for EV adoption, I understand within this larger framing argument that shifting to 100% renewable energy by 2050 without efforts to reduce energy use is technically and economically feasible with little downside. It's surprisingly common to hear either this sort of statement directly or implied in mainstream arguments. And then you have the sort of economist approach, or classic economist approach here. That says, what about all the lithium and other finite materials used in these batteries? Well, they're just not an issue because battery packs will require less than 1% of the known reserves of lithium, nickel, manganese, and copper, and 4% of the world's cobalt. And it's sort of ignores the context in which these materials are found and extracted. And it also allows the electric vehicles to be constructed as zero emissions. They reduce direct emissions where they're driven, but they are certainly not zero emissions. So there are a lot of externalities to be accounted for. The water intensity of extraction and processing is one of them that is a growing area to look at. And it also, this type of statement obscures the uneven geographic distributions of the benefits and burdens of this transition. So I take a commodity chains approach, focusing on the batteries. And this term came from the global systems theory people like Wallerstein in the 70s. And in the beginning, it had a strong bent towards looking at class differences and capitalism. And then later we build on it with intersectionality and including issues around race and gender and so forth. And then finally here I include staying with the trouble, which is an approach from Haraway in science and technology studies that reminds us who would do critical theory that we need to Remember the non-innocence of these things while also keeping in mind the benefits. So the electric vehicle revolution does reduce emissions, and it does have the potential for economic and social development. It's complicated. So we look at, so the beginning in global systems was sort of a top-down approach, and staying with the trouble is very much a bottom-up materialist approach to like caring for specific contexts and material transformations. So breaking these stages down, it turns out to be more complicated than one might thought at first. I started with 3 in the paper. Now I've got at least 5. In the corner here is this classic Campbell sustainability triangle with equity, economy, and environment, which is particularly relevant for the extraction and refining phases. And then manufacturing, driving is or use of the product, and then post-car life are the basic 5 stages I've got so far. Extraction is the first. There are a ton of different materials in a lithium-ion battery. This is just a few examples. Cobalt comes up a lot at industry conferences. That came up at the Nordic EV summit last month. There's research on this that by Benjamin Sovacool, for example, and what he came up with, his final conclusion was that what we need is better regulations and more commitment to improving cobalt mining there that benefits the people. The industry solution is primarily to come up with innovation so we don't need cobalt anymore because the Congo's problematic. So 2 different approaches to dealing with a mineral that's or a metal that's connected to social and environmental problems. Then we have lithium, of course, is a big one. Actually, China and Australia are currently the biggest extractors, but you hear a lot about the lithium triangle in South America. It's really interesting to have these 3 countries with very different approaches to this resource. So Bolivia has massive deposits, but it almost doesn't extract any of it, primarily for fears of being exploited. It's complicated. And Chile has it was leading and had the potential to be exporting more than China and Australia, but there's been resistance from indigenous groups and protests. So they're writing a new constitution now, which will have implications for lithium mining. And it's interesting that this constitutional crisis started due to protests over hiking the fares to public transport. Like people could not afford them to raise prices for them to take the buses and metro, which led to, it was such a big issue that it led to massive uprising, and now they're rewriting their constitution. And that'll have impacts on whether or not they will be supplying more lithium for the electric cars in the north. Last week, there were massive protests. Thousands of people in Serbia were in the streets protesting the government's plans to have new lithium mines there. So even just looking at lithium, it starts to be a PhD in and of itself. And then there's a lot of other extractive sites involved as well. Then you've got refining. This is, or processing, primarily in China. In the bottom corner there, you can see this is a massive sludge lake in northern China, Mongolia, where they do, they also have mining, but massive factories for processing. And we have some research showing that it looks uninhabited, but the dust from this places that evaporates, travels really far and is found in the hair of people all over the region in distant places. Manufacturing, how am I doing for time? Okay. So you might have heard of bottlenecks due to semiconductors. These are primarily manufactured in Taiwan, and it's not an easy thing to build a new semiconductor factory. What we are doing in Europe is building battery cell factories. There's one in Berlin. We've got one coming, I think it's in Mo i Rana in Norway. I think that's the Freya factory. So that's another stage with its own specialties to look at. Use, you've got, this is a picture that was part of an NRK investigative journalism project where they showed that a lot of electric vehicles were being scrapped after only 5 years on the road. And one of the reasons this happens is a regulatory lag, that these batteries are considered a hazardous waste. And then there's also the industry itself is electric car industry. Claims that due to cybersecurity and due to the dangers of working with the batteries, that you can only have their official people work on these cars. So in response, there's a right to repair movement that is being discussed in the EU and in the States about who should be allowed to work on these cars and what kinds of cybersecurity issues are real, and what is the industry trying to sort of maintain value within its own chains. And another issue here is the secondhand car markets. So this is because EVs are so new, this is a brand new issue. And the most important thing to know if you're buying an electric car used is the health of the battery. And there's just no way to know that right now. So that's one of the many tracking issues, probably a new digital tracking tool that's coupled with regulation to help consumers know whether or not they can, give them confidence so that they can buy secondhand EVs. And then the end of life. So, oh, I skipped one, the driving. Well, it's all right. End of life. This is the most nascent, sort of emergent, I can't even say industry, like several industries. So after a car is done on the road, the battery still likely has a lot of juice left in it. It can be reused for stationary purposes. There's some pilots that are interesting on this, but nothing at scale. We have recycling facilities just beginning to get off the ground now. One of them in Fredrikstad is being built. I'm not sure if it is just completed or is going to be completed this spring. And so that you have these industry actors sort of seeing this huge opportunity with all of these EVs about to be on the roads and the recycling there. And then, so private sector, and then you have the regulators who are also trying to keep up with this really rapid transition. In January, like next month, we're supposed to have the first proposals for EU regulations on battery supply chain tracking and recycling. And that is probably going to rely on some new digital tools. Something they're floating is called a battery passport, which is by the sort of proposed by the Global Battery Alliance. And then there's some blockchain companies that would like to be the providers of this type of tracking. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there that there's very little research on because it hasn't happened yet. That will also be part of this. And most of this, like the battery passport and the tracking, will have to do with what's good for the recycling industry in Europe. But there's maybe some potential to include things like a water footprint or a carbon footprint, or things that have more to do with what happened upstream, rather than just the technical details they need to know to dismantle this battery, for more supply chain accountability. So, okay, good. That was 15 minutes. So the final points here are that my project anyway isn't so much about whether EVs are a good idea. They do reduce emissions, and that is important. And we have a lot of life cycle analyses, like technical research projects that show that even accounting for the water and the carbon involved in the whole chain, electric vehicles are still better than internal combustion vehicles, but we still need to account for these trade-offs, and that they perpetuate, like switching just from an old car to an electric car, if it isn't going to challenge regimes of automobility, then we're just perpetuating the same distribution of benefits and burdens. these sort of relations of power and production that we've had since colonialism. And so technologies can't just displace the need for reducing resource and energy use in the global north. But with these new digital tools, there's maybe some potential for more accountability, both social and environmental, in these supply chain tracking tools.